Every terrible idea starts the same way, with confidence. Not the quiet kind that comes from experience, the loud kind. The kind that says, "Relax, I've got this." The kind that convinces a grown adult that gravity is negotiable, electricity is basically just spicy air, and a running industrial machine is something you can figure out. Tonight we're not watching accidents. We're watching decisions. 10 moments where someone looked at a dangerous situation and decided they were smarter than the situation. People who believed warning labels were written for other people. People who treated physics like a polite suggestion instead of a universal law. These are the kinds of decisions that eventually earn a very special prize. The Darwin Awards, an unofficial honor given to individuals who managed to remove themselves from the human gene pool in ways so unbelievably stupid, they almost feel like performance art. Every story tonight follows the same formula. A bad idea, a worse execution, and a final, very permanent curtain call. Let's begin. 1. The perfect jump that worked too well. Fact number 1. Norway is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Towering cliffs, endless fjords, wind-carved mountains rising thousands of feet above the water, like the planet itself is trying to show off. It's also one of the most popular destinations in the world for base jumping, which makes sense. When you're the kind of person who believes jumping off a cliff with a parachute is a relaxing weekend activity, Norway is basically Disneyland. Jesper and Lars were exactly that kind of person. They weren't just adrenaline junkies, they were content creators. Every jump they made was filmed, edited, and posted online for the growing community of extreme sports fans who love watching people flirt with gravity. But views are a cruel motivator. Once you've jumped off a few cliffs, the internet stops caring. To stay relevant, you need something new, something bigger, something nobody has done before. So the two friends came up with a plan, not just a jump, a perfectly synchronized jump. They would stand side by side at the edge of a Norwegian cliff, count down together, leap at the exact same millisecond, fall in perfect parallel formation, and deploy their parachutes simultaneously in midair. Two jumpers, two identical arcs through the sky, two parachutes blooming open at the exact same moment, like a perfectly choreographed ballet with gravity. It would look incredible on camera. And to be fair, the first half of the plan worked flawlessly. They counted down. 3, 2, 1. They leaped. For several seconds, the footage was exactly what they dreamed of. Two bodies falling through open air in perfect formation, wind roaring past their helmets, the rocky cliffs racing upward beneath them. It was the shot of a lifetime. Then came the grand finale, the moment they had practiced over and over again. They both reached for their ripcords, and with perfect synchronization, they pulled. The parachutes exploded open behind them with a loud whoosh. But instead of two separate canopies saving two separate lives, the nylon fabric instantly collided. Jesper's parachute lines tangled with Lars's canopy. Lars's chute wrapped around Jesper's harness. In less than a second, two perfectly functioning safety systems transformed into one massive spinning knot of fabric and cord. Instead of gliding, they began to plummet. The tragic irony was almost mathematical. If either of them had deployed even half a second earlier or later, they would have been fine. But their teamwork had been flawless, and that perfection turned their parachutes into a single, useless tangle. They fell the rest of the way to the ground together, a perfectly synchronized jump, executed with fatal precision. 2. The efficiency upgrade that worked too well. Every neighborhood has that guy. The DIY legend, the man who believes every professional service is just a scam invented to charge money for something you can absolutely do yourself with enough confidence, a ladder, and a power tool that sounds like a helicopter taking off. This particular homeowner in Connecticut fit that description perfectly. His latest project was simple: trim a massive old oak tree in his yard. The branches had grown long and heavy, and he decided it was time to clean things up. Normally, this kind of job follows a basic, boring process. You cut the branches, they fall to the ground, then you drag them over to a wood chipper. But dragging branches across the yard is slow. inefficient, repetitive. And our hero was not a man who tolerated inefficiency. Standing there, looking at the tree, he had what he believed was a stroke of genius. Why move the branches to the wood chipper when you could move the wood chipper to the branches? He rented a massive industrial-grade machine, not the small kind landscapers casually toss twigs into. This was a roaring diesel monster designed to devour entire tree limbs like a mechanical wood-eating dragon. Then, he positioned it directly underneath the oak tree. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Climb ladder, cut branch, drop branch. Wood chipper eats branch instantly. No dragging, no extra steps, maximum efficiency. A closed-loop system for yard waste. He fired up the chipper, its engine roaring like a chainsaw the size of a refrigerator. The blades inside spun with terrifying speed as he climbed the ladder, chainsaw in hand, feeling like the Henry Ford of suburban landscaping. And for a while, it worked beautifully. He'd cut a branch. It would fall straight down into the machine. The chipper would immediately devour it with a violent crunch and spray of wood chips. Cut, drop, done. Over and over again. He was probably standing on that ladder feeling like an absolute genius. But efficiency has a dark side, because when you design a system that removes all extra steps, you also remove all margin for error. At one point, he leaned a little too far to reach another branch. His foot slipped. Normally, a slip from a ladder means a bruised ego and maybe a twisted ankle. But he wasn't standing above grass. He was standing above a running industrial wood chipper. Gravity did the rest. In the span of a few seconds, he went from being the project manager to becoming part of the project. His perfectly optimized workflow had worked exactly as designed. Branches went in, and unfortunately, so did everything else. It remains one of the most brutally ironic lessons in DIY history, because while he set out to eliminate wasted motion in his yard work, the system he built ended up eliminating far more than that. 3. The gun safety demonstration that worked perfectly. Some arguments are settled with logic, some are settled with experience, and some are settled with a gunshot. Our next story takes place in a quiet living room in Colorado, where a man had recently purchased a brand new handgun and was proudly showing it off to his girlfriend. She was nervous, which, to be fair, is a completely reasonable reaction when someone brings a firearm into the house and starts handling it like a new kitchen gadget. But our hero saw things differently. In his mind, her fear wasn't caution, it was ignorance. And he, naturally, was about to fix that problem with a demonstration of his superior knowledge. He held the gun confidently, explaining each feature like a proud salesman presenting the latest smartphone. "See this?" he said, pointing at the safety. "This thing is designed so the gun can't fire accidentally." He clicked the mechanism on and off with a little flourish. Then he showed her the trigger safety, then the internal safety, then the slide. His tone probably had that familiar mixture of confidence and mild condescension people adopt when they're absolutely certain they are the smartest person in the room. His girlfriend still looked uneasy, which, unfortunately, triggered something far more dangerous than the weapon itself: his ego. Because now, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a challenge to his authority as the resident gun expert. And when someone's ego enters the room, logic usually leaves through the nearest window. So he decided to perform the ultimate proof, the grand finale of his demonstration. "If this thing was dangerous," he said confidently, "I wouldn't do this." And then, to prove how safe the gun was, he pointed it directly at his own chest. For a moment, the room probably went quiet. His girlfriend likely froze, waiting for the punchline. But there was no punchline. Instead, he placed his finger on the trigger and pulled it. The gun fired instantly. The sound of the shot echoed through the small room like the closing line of a very short and very tragic lecture. The demonstration had been completely successful. The gun had not malfunctioned. It had not fired accidentally. It had done exactly what firearms are designed to do when someone deliberately pulls the trigger. It fired. He collapsed to the floor with a look of what witnesses later described as complete shock, which is understandable. Moments earlier, he had been explaining how impossible this exact situation was. In the end, he won the argument. He proved beyond any doubt that the gun worked exactly as advertised. He just wasn't around afterward to enjoy being right. A powerful reminder that the most important safety feature on any firearm is not on the gun, it's in the brain of the person holding it. 4. The homemade gin that invented a new kind of explosion. There are two types of people who make alcohol at home. The first type carefully studies chemistry, ventilation, and safety. The second type believes that watching 3 YouTube videos makes them a master distiller. Angus belonged firmly in the second category. He lived in Scotland, which means 2 things were practically guaranteed in his life: cold weather and a deep cultural appreciation for alcohol. But Angus didn't just want to drink it, he wanted to create it. In his mind, he wasn't just a guy messing around in a garden shed, he was an artisan distiller. A rebellious entrepreneur standing proudly against the boring corporate liquor industry. His dream was to produce the next great craft gin, small batch, handmade, authentic, and produced entirely inside a cramped wooden shed behind his house. Inside that shed, he had assembled his masterpiece, a homemade copper still. Pipes, tanks, coils, and heating elements cobbled together into something that looked like a cross between a science experiment and a small submarine engine. To Angus, it was beautiful. To anyone with basic chemistry knowledge, it was a bomb waiting for an excuse. Distilling alcohol produces extremely high-proof ethanol vapor, invisible, highly flammable, and very good at filling enclosed spaces with explosive potential. But Angus wasn't thinking about vapor density or ignition sources. He was thinking about flavor notes: juniper, coriander, a hint of citrus. On the night of the accident, he had started a fresh batch. The still bubbled happily, while a thin stream of clear gin dripped into a glass container. The air in the shed slowly filled with sweet alcohol fumes. To make matters more interesting, it was freezing outside, so Angus had placed a small electric space heater in the corner to keep himself warm while he worked. The heater's metal coils glowed bright orange, a quiet little sun in a room full of invisible fuel. At some point, Angus decided he couldn't wait to taste the new batch. Why let it cool down properly when you could sample it straight from the source? He leaned forward with the glass, reaching over the still to catch a fresh pour of high-proof gin. As he moved, he unknowingly stirred the dense cloud of ethanol vapor that had been collecting around the floor. The vapor drifted, slowly, quietly, until it touched the glowing coils of the heater. What happened next took less than a second. The entire shed atmosphere ignited with a violent whump as the alcohol vapor detonated into a rolling blue fireball. The still itself, now superheated and filled with boiling alcohol, ruptured under the pressure like a grenade. The explosion blew the wooden walls of the shed outward and launched the roof several feet into the air. Neighbors later described the sound as something between a thunderclap and a cannon blast. By the time firefighters arrived, the shed was gone. So was Angus's distillery. And unfortunately, so was Angus. His dream had been to create a gin with a truly unforgettable finish. In a way, he succeeded. He just never got the chance to write the tasting notes. 5. The human alarm clock experiment. Every bad idea begins with a sentence that sounds brilliant in your own head. Usually something like, "Technically, this should work." Our next story comes from a man who believed he had discovered the perfect napping system, and unfortunately for him, it involved a railroad track. It was a warm afternoon somewhere in rural America. Quiet countryside, wide open sky, the kind of peaceful setting that practically begs for a lazy nap in the sun. Our hero loved naps. He also loved clever ideas. And on this particular day, while staring at a set of train tracks running through the countryside, he had what he believed was an engineering breakthrough. Railroad tracks vibrate when a train is approaching. Everyone knows that. The heavy steel wheels create vibrations that travel through the rails long before the train actually arrives. So in his mind, this created a perfect natural alarm clock. His theory was simple. If he lay down on the tracks and used one rail as a pillow, the vibration from an approaching train would travel through the steel and wake him up long before the train got close. He would feel the rumble, wake up, step aside, and continue his day refreshed from a perfectly timed nap. To him, it was genius, a self-regulating safety system built directly into the infrastructure. So he stretched out on the track, resting his head on the rail like it was the most comfortable pillow in the world. Then he fell asleep. And here's the strange part. His theory actually worked. Eventually, the distant vibration of a freight train began humming through the steel rail. The gentle tremor traveled directly into his skull and woke him up exactly as he had predicted. For one brief moment, his experiment was a complete success. He opened his eyes, felt the vibration, and probably thought something like, "See, I knew this would work." But there was just one tiny detail he had miscalculated: the timing. Yes, the vibration arrives before the train, but not minutes before, not even 30 seconds before, sometimes only a few seconds. When he finally lifted his head and looked down the track, the train was already there. Not a distant rumble, not a tiny dot on the horizon. A massive steel freight engine roaring directly toward him, close enough that the horn blast probably felt like an explosion inside his skull. At that point, there was no time to think, no time to stand up calmly, no time to even roll off the rail properly. The alarm clock had worked perfectly. The wake-up call had arrived exactly on schedule. Unfortunately, so had the train. His experiment proved something very important. Railroad tracks can absolutely wake you up before a train arrives. They just don't give you enough time to do anything about it. 6. The smuggler who became a human birdcage. Smuggling exotic animals is already a terrible idea, but if you're going to do it, there is at least one basic rule most criminals try to follow: never let the animals wake up. Our next Darwin candidate learned that rule the hard way, at 30,000 feet. The man had decided to enter the lucrative world of exotic bird smuggling. Rare parrots, especially brightly colored tropical species, can sell for enormous prices on the black market. But getting them through airport security is the tricky part. Cages are obvious. Boxes are suspicious. So he came up with what he believed was a brilliantly discreet solution. He would turn his own body into the cargo container. Before boarding the flight, he sedated several rare parrots to keep them quiet. Then, using tape and cloth, he carefully strapped the sleeping birds against his torso and legs underneath loose, oversized clothing. Baggy trousers, loose jacket, problem solved. From the outside, he probably just looked slightly bulky, like a man who skipped leg day but never missed dessert. Underneath the clothes, however, he was essentially a walking aviary. The plan worked perfectly at first. He waddled through the airport, boarded the plane, sat down in his seat. Security noticed nothing. For the first hour of the flight, everything remained quiet. The parrot stayed asleep, the passengers minded their own business, and our smuggler likely sat there feeling like the criminal mastermind of the century. Then the sedatives wore off. Parrots are not subtle animals. When they wake up somewhere unfamiliar, especially taped to a sweaty human body inside a dark pair of pants, they tend to express their dissatisfaction very loudly and very sharply. The first bite probably surprised him. A sudden stab of pain somewhere near his thigh. Then another, and another. Soon several angry parrots were fully awake and attempting to chew their way out of what they understandably considered a very uncomfortable prison. The man began twitching in his seat, then squirming, then quietly yelping in pain while trying to keep his composure. But there is only so much dignity a person can maintain while multiple parrots are biting them through their pants. Passengers nearby started noticing the strange noises. Little muffled squawks, sharp gasps, occasional panicked movements from seat 23B. Then came the moment that ended the entire operation. One of the birds managed to poke its head through the fabric of his clothing and let out a full-volume tropical scream. Flight attendants immediately rushed over. Security was called, and the world's most poorly ventilated bird sanctuary was quickly discovered. By the time the plane landed, the smuggler had been arrested, the parrots confiscated, and the passengers had all witnessed one of the strangest in-flight incidents imaginable. He had tried to smuggle rare birds through airport security. Instead, he accidentally turned himself into a very loud evidence container. And the parrots, understandably furious about the entire arrangement, were more than happy to testify. 7. The romantic gesture that went terribly right. Arguments between couples usually end with someone storming out of the room. Occasionally, someone sleeps on the couch. Very rarely, someone jumps off a building. But that's exactly where this story goes. Ivan and his girlfriend Svetlana were having a heated argument in their 9th-floor apartment somewhere in Russia. It was one of those classic relationship fights, loud, emotional, and probably about something that wouldn't matter 2 days later. At some point during the argument, Svetlana, frustrated and dramatic, threw out a line that millions of people have said sarcastically before. "What would you even do for me?" she snapped. "You'd probably jump off a building if I asked you, wouldn't you?" It was sarcasm, hyperbole, the kind of exaggerated statement people use when they're angry. But Ivan didn't hear sarcasm. Ivan heard a challenge. And Ivan was the kind of man who believed love should be demonstrated with bold, heroic gestures. So without another word, he calmly walked toward the balcony. Svetlana was still mid-argument when she noticed what he was doing. At first, she probably assumed he was just being dramatic, maybe leaning over the railing, maybe pretending to threaten something stupid. But Ivan didn't stop. He climbed over the railing. For a brief moment, he stood there on the outside ledge of the 9th-floor balcony, looking back at her with the determined expression of a man about to perform a deeply unnecessary act of devotion. Then he jumped, 9 stories down. Now, if this story followed the usual Darwin Awards formula, this would be the end of Ivan. But fate had something stranger in mind, because the city had just experienced a massive snowstorm, and directly below the building was an enormous pile of freshly fallen snow, deep, soft, and packed high against the base of the apartment complex. Ivan landed in it. Not on pavement, not on concrete, on what was essentially a giant natural airbag. He sank into the snow, rolled over, stood up, and brushed himself off completely unharmed. For a brief moment, he probably felt incredibly proud of himself. He had just proven his love, survived a 9-story jump, and now he looked up toward the balcony, expecting to see a shocked, amazed girlfriend staring down at him. Instead, what Svetlana had seen from above looked very different. From her perspective, the man she loved had just jumped to what appeared to be his certain death. The shock hit her instantly. Her body reacted before her brain could process what had happened. She fainted. And unfortunately, she fainted forward. Her unconscious body collapsed against the balcony railing, tipped over it, and fell the same 9 stories Ivan had just survived. But she didn't land in snow. She hit the pavement. Ivan had jumped to prove his love and survived without a scratch. Svetlana had fainted from witnessing that love and died instantly. It's one of those stories so darkly ironic it almost sounds fictional. A man who literally jumped for love, and the person he jumped for never made it to the happy ending. 8. The day it literally rained monkeys. Sometimes people die doing something incredibly stupid. Sometimes they die doing something incredibly dangerous. And sometimes, they die simply because the universe decided to run a very strange experiment in gravity. This story takes place on a busy street in India, the kind of place where traffic, pedestrians, scooters, food carts, and the occasional sacred cow all share the same chaotic space. But there was something else living above that street. Monkeys. Lots of them. Urban monkeys are common in many parts of India. They treat cities the way humans treat parks, places to hang out, steal food, and generally cause trouble. On this particular day, an entire troop had gathered in the branches of a large tree that stretched over the sidewalk. Big monkeys, small monkeys, dozens of them. Jumping, chasing each other, screeching, grooming, and generally behaving like a furry, hyperactive neighborhood gang. Now normally, that's just background noise in a busy city. But the tree branch they were sitting on had one problem. It was old. And it was supporting far more monkey weight than nature originally intended. Meanwhile, down on the sidewalk below, a man was walking to wherever people walk on normal afternoons. Work, lunch, home. No one knows. What we do know is that he had absolutely no idea he was about to become part of one of the strangest accidents ever recorded. As he walked beneath the tree, the monkeys above him continued their chaotic activity. One jumped, then another, then another. Each small leap added a little more stress to the aging branch. Wood fibers creaked, tiny fractures formed, but nobody noticed. Then the final monkey jumped onto the branch. That was it. The branch snapped with a loud crack that echoed down the street. In the span of 1 second, gravity collected its payment. The entire branch collapsed, and with it came the entire troop of monkeys. What followed was described by witnesses as something straight out of a cartoon. A massive tree limb, hundreds of pounds of wood, crashed downward. Along with it came a screaming avalanche of startled monkeys. The man looked up just in time to see what can only be described as a rainstorm of primates and tree branches. He didn't have time to react. The branch struck him instantly. Several monkeys landed with it in a chaotic pile of fur, splintered wood, and confused, screaming animals. First responders arriving at the scene reportedly struggled to process what they were looking at: a collapsed tree branch, dozens of panicked monkeys, and a tragedy caused by the world's most bizarre combination of bad timing and bad luck. Unlike most Darwin Award stories, this man hadn't done anything reckless. He hadn't challenged gravity, he hadn't ignored warning signs, he had simply walked down the street. Unfortunately, he happened to do it at the exact moment when a very overcrowded monkey meeting lost its structural support, and on that particular day, gravity had chosen him as the landing zone. 9. The man who tried to outdrink the Russian winter. There are many things you should never challenge in life: a grizzly bear, an active volcano, and especially the Russian winter. Unfortunately, vodka has a remarkable ability to convince people that these rules are optional. This story begins on a brutally cold night somewhere in rural Russia, the kind of cold where the air hurts your lungs and every breath feels like inhaling tiny knives. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing. The nearby river had turned into a solid sheet of ice, stretching across the landscape like a frozen highway. Inside a small gathering of friends, the alcohol was flowing freely. Vodka shots turned into arguments. Arguments turned into boasts. And eventually, someone said the words that have started more disasters in human history than almost anything else. You wouldn't do it. The man at the center of this story had been loudly bragging about his toughness. According to him, the cold didn't affect him like it affected everyone else. He was built different, stronger, harder, a true son of Russia. To prove his point, he made a bold declaration. He was going to swim across the river in January. Now, any sober person would immediately understand why this is a terrible idea. Water that cold doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It triggers something called cold shock response. The moment a human body hits near freezing water, breathing becomes uncontrollable, muscles lock up, and the heart can experience a violent spike in stress. In other words, the body panics. But our hero wasn't thinking about physiology. He was thinking about pride. So he stripped down to his underwear, ignoring the horrified protests of his friends, and marched toward the open patch of dark water near the bridge where the river hadn't fully frozen. The water steamed in the frigid air like a black hole in the ice. Without hesitation, he ran forward and jumped. The moment his body hit the water, reality arrived. The cold was not refreshing, it was violent. His lungs seized as an involuntary gasp forced air from his chest. His muscles instantly tightened as if every nerve in his body had been plugged into an electrical outlet. The confident swimmer who planned to glide across the river vanished instantly. In his place was a man thrashing wildly in water that was rapidly shutting down his body. Within seconds, his movements slowed. Within less than a minute, he slipped beneath the surface. The river, calm and silent again, closed over him. His bold attempt to prove he was tougher than the winter had lasted roughly the same amount of time as a microwave popcorn commercial. The Russian winter had accepted his challenge, and as it has for centuries, it won without saying a word. 10. The wingsuit flight that was almost perfect. Extreme sports have a simple rule. The margin for error is 0. You can be incredibly skilled, you can train for years, you can calculate wind speed, altitude, trajectory, and timing with scientific precision, but in the end, you are still a fragile human body traveling through the air at highway speed. And sometimes, all it takes is 1 inch. This story comes from Norway again, a country whose dramatic cliffs and deep mountain valleys have turned it into a playground for the most fearless wingsuit pilots on Earth. Wingsuit flying is the closest thing humans have to real flight. A jumper leaps from a cliff wearing a specially designed suit that stretches fabric between the arms and legs, creating wings. Instead of falling straight down, they glide forward through the air, carving through mountain landscapes at speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. To the people who do it, it feels like freedom. To everyone else, it looks like gravity patiently waiting for a mistake. Anders and his friend were among the best in the sport, experienced, respected, and part of a new generation of wingsuit pilots who are pushing the limits while filming everything for their growing audience online. But like many extreme athletes, they believed skill could overcome risk. Their latest idea was ambitious. They were going to perform a synchronized wingsuit flight through a narrow mountain gorge. Not just 2 jumps, 2 pilots flying side by side in formation, wingtip to wingtip, like fighter jets threading through a canyon. The footage would be incredible, the kind of video that spreads across the internet overnight. The day of the jump was perfect. Clear skies, calm winds, a wide, silent Norwegian valley stretching below them. Helmet cameras recording everything. They stepped to the edge of the cliff and reviewed the plan one last time. Anders would lead. His friend would follow closely beside him, mirroring every movement. The key to making the footage dramatic was proximity. Anders planned to fly extremely close to the canyon wall so the camera could capture the rock racing past at terrifying speed. They counted down, 3, 2, 1, and jumped. For the first moments of the flight, everything was flawless. 2 wingsuit pilots slicing through the air in perfect formation, the mountains rushing past them in a blur of stone and wind. It looked like something out of a dream. But flying that close to rock leaves no room for surprises, and the mountains always have one variable you cannot fully control: the wind. As Anders skimmed along the canyon wall, a small gust of air peeled off the rock face. Not a storm, not a violent blast, just a tiny invisible shift in the air. At normal speeds, it would mean nothing. At 100 miles per hour, it changed everything. The gust nudged his wingsuit just a few inches off his intended line. That was enough. The edge of his wing clipped a jagged piece of rock. The effect was instant. Instead of gliding smoothly through the canyon, the suit snagged and spun his body violently sideways. The controlled flight turned into a chaotic tumble through open air. His partner's camera captured the moment perfectly. 1 second, flawless flight. The next second, uncontrolled spinning. At that speed, deploying a parachute becomes almost impossible. The body twists too violently, the lines tangle, the altitude disappears far too quickly. Within moments, Anders vanished into the canyon below. A flight that had been planned for weeks, executed with incredible skill, and undone by a few inches of wind. In extreme sports, perfection isn't enough. You also need luck. And on that day, luck was not flying with them. 10 stories, 10 completely different people. Different countries, different lives, different kinds of mistakes. But every single one of them shared the same fatal ingredient: confidence. The DIY genius who thought efficiency made him smarter than a wood chipper. The gun expert who believed the safety features mattered more than the trigger he was pulling. The distiller who forgot that alcohol vapor and electric heaters make a surprisingly effective bomb. The man who believed a train would politely wait for him to wake up. The smuggler who underestimated a dozen angry parrots. The romantic who took sarcasm literally. The man who challenged the Russian winter to a swimming contest. The wingsuit pilot who trusted the wind a little too much. Different situations, same mistake. The quiet belief that the rules apply to everyone else. The Darwin Awards exist for one simple reason: to remind the rest of us what happens when confidence outruns common sense. These stories aren't about bad luck. They're about decisions. Tiny moments where someone had the chance to stop, to think, to ask a very simple question. Maybe this is a terrible idea. But ego is a powerful thing. It whispers things like, relax, I know what I'm doing. What's the worst that could happen? And eventually, reality answers. Gravity doesn't negotiate. Electricity doesn't care about confidence. And physics has never once lost an argument with a human being. So now the verdict belongs to you. Which of these stories do you think deserves the Darwin Award for the dumbest decision? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy watching the strange ways humans manage to lose arguments with reality, make sure you subscribe. Because trust me, the internet has plenty more examples.